I'm Jessica Einhorn, and I'm the Dean of SAIS here in Washington, D.C., with our campuses, of course, in Bologna and in Nanjing, China. And I'm delighted to welcome you all again, because many of you, of course, were at the reception yesterday evening at the Woodrow Wilson Center, to this conference, which focuses on the important issue of regionalism in Africa and the development of the African regional institutions. I think I'm preaching to the converted here when I say that regionalism is really at the center of resolving any problem and almost all the problems that we confront in developing Africa and bringing peace and prosperity there, and also that regionalism is the opportunity fulfilling even greater ambitions that are necessarily on the ground at this time. The importance of international cooperation, the United States, the European Union, China, each of these areas is facing their own huge domestic challenges in a global economy that seems to be hard to predict and under a great deal of stress. But it's important, and this conference is an important part of that, to make sure that they not become too introverted and that instead they keep looking out and working with the Africans, the very capable Africans now, to meet their challenges. The key challenges that I know you're going to be covering at this meeting begin with peace and security, how to build African capacity itself for peacekeeping and mediation and conflict management. A second very important area, very important to the SAIS curriculum, is how to advance intra-regional trade and trade with key external partners. Every day has a different story about Doha, on, off, ad hoc, regional, binational, but the trade opportunities with Africa are the center of our attention here today. And infrastructure, how to alleviate critical infrastructure. Well, you're here in Washington, D.C. We have our own set of problems about that. Those of you who came by metro, I doubt that you had an escalator that was running when you came out, and hopefully you weren't managing your bags in Union Station. But those are the three areas, the bottlenecks in infrastructure on a regional basis, not just country by country. The other economic challenges are well known. My career was at the World Bank. I spent almost 20 years at the World Bank. And so growth, poverty, alleviation, the very important role of education, as well as health and the other human resource issues in the continent are also of importance and will be somewhat addressed in this conference. I like to think that SAIS is the perfect place. I know that Woodrow Wilson is a great partner for you to have these conversations. Our students are adventuresome and idealistic. The average age of the student is 26. It's a hugely international crowd. They come from all over the world to Washington, but of course half our first-year class is in Bologna, and a growing number are coming to us from Nanjing. Under the very capable leadership of Peter Lewis, we have a thriving and very important in terms of its scholarly interests and its outreach and its impact, our Africa program at SAIS. Needless to say, it is an honor, whether it is in his hometown, Bologna, or in Washington, D.C., to have Romano Prodi here. And for me, in fact, a personal pleasure also to have his colleague and my good friend, Alessandro Ovi. So welcome to all and to our friends, and I'm here with you. I'm just going to get a beverage, but let's start the program, and I hope that you have a very productive day.
Thank you. Yeah, it works. Thank you, really, to be here. It was yesterday a very, very productive introduction to our meeting, and today we get into the problems. This morning's section is to deal with the new challenge let's say, to the future. We have quite a few changes in Africa, and our discussion will help us, and I do hope everybody else, how to deal with them. I will share the responsibility of chairing with Mrs. Ezekwesili, that she is here from the World Bank, and I'm very grateful that she could come with us in a period in which they are not without some problems to solve. Yesterday, the introduction was based mainly on the great issues we have to tackle now in order to promote cooperation among African countries. Let's say I always use the utopian but important terminology of African Union, African unity, in order to stress the necessity of the direction in which we have to work. The program this morning is very simple. We have 4 speakers. Johnnie Carson, Assistant Secretary of State for Africa of United States Department. Zachary Muburi-Muita, Head of United Nations Office to the African Union. Guijin Liu, Ambassador and Special Representative for African Affairs of the People's Republic of China, and the Ambassador of Italy to United States, Giulio Terzi di Sant'Agata. So I don't want to steal time to these top speakers, and I give the floor to Johnnie Carson.
Prime Minister Prodi, thank you very much for the kind introduction, as well as I'd like to also thank the Dean of the SAIS, Dr. Einhorn, as well. I want to start by thanking the Woodrow Wilson Center, the Foundation for Worldwide Cooperation, and the Johns Hopkins School for Advanced International Studies for organizing this conference and inviting me to participate in this panel this morning. It is a great honor to be sharing the stage with my distinguished diplomatic colleagues. I have just yesterday morning returned from Africa, where I traveled with Secretary Clinton to Zambia, Tanzania, and Ethiopia. This was Secretary Clinton's second trip to Africa as Secretary of State, and culminated in a major speech at the African Union, which demonstrated the importance the United States attaches to regional cooperation and multilateralism. It is only through greater cooperation and eventual integration that African nations can tackle their many challenges and realize their full potential as stable and economically viable democracies. And it is only with a more cohesive Africa that the United States and the international community can effectively tackle the many interrelated challenges we face together, particularly poverty, global warming, and transnational crime and terrorism. Over the past 2 decades, the scope of Africa's challenges have become more transnational and therefore necessitated policy responses that enhance regional cooperation, particularly through organizations such as the African Union, the Economic Community of West Africa, known as ECOWAS, the Southern African Development Community, known as SADC, and the East African Community, known as the EAC. Multilateral responses might be slower and more cumbersome to execute, but they are more likely to succeed in the long run than approaches that lack broad support and participation. multilateralism over unilateralism is far more important in bringing about the desired results that we all want, both politically and economically. The AU and ECOWAS leadership proved critical for resolving political crises in Niger, Guinea, and Cote d'Ivoire over the past 2 years. AU leadership also helped to ensure the referendum on Southern independence in Sudan took place as scheduled this past January. And the African Union has demonstrated remarkable resolve in its peacekeeping missions, especially in Somalia, where the ongoing conflict poses a growing threat to neighboring countries and also to the international community as a result of piracy and counterterrorism issues. Whether through aggressive diplomacy or direct material support and training, the United States has actively supported these regional organizations and these regional approaches and continues to explore ways of building the security capacity and increasing the effectiveness of these organizations at the continental level as well as at the sub-regional level. Despite this increased cooperation on political and security issues, Africa has made less progress in overcoming the legacy of economic balkanization that has endured since the colonial period. This legacy is reflected in the low level of intra-African trade, about 10% as a share of the continent's total trade. In fact, African trade as a regional bloc is the lowest of any regional bloc in the world. By comparison, trade within Europe has been about 60% and 40% within North America. Recent studies published by McKinsey and the Center for Global Development highlight Africa's economic potential, represented in part by its vast internal market of about 1 billion people. African countries, however, will not be able to realize this enormous economic potential as long as tariffs and other barriers continue to impede trade and investment. Without broad access to each other's markets, most African countries will not be able to achieve the high levels of economic growth required to lift their populations out of poverty and to meet the Millennium Challenge goals. Some organizations, such as ECOWAS and the EAC, have in principle laid the groundwork for regional economic integration, but their members have a long way to go towards actual implementation of their stated goals and objectives. We all need to continue to encourage them to move forward and to make progress and to assist them as we can in doing so. In the coming years, Africa's challenges will only grow more complex and transnational in nature. 3 trends in particular are likely to demand a rethinking of our policies and even greater regional cooperation on the part of Africa itself. The first is the proliferation of advanced technologies that are of enormous benefit for Africa's economic, social, and political development, but can also be used by criminal and terrorist networks in ways that undermine Africa's welfare and long-term stability. Militants in southern and northern Nigeria, for example, are conducting increasingly sophisticated bomb attacks and are leveraging the internet to develop their skills and disseminate their messages. Extremist groups in Somalia, likewise, have acquired the technical expertise to conduct complex bomb attacks, including outside Somalia, and have exploited the internet to recruit foreign fighters from the United States and Western Europe. International narcotics traffickers have established networks across the continent, particularly in West Africa, for moving drugs originating mostly in South America to Europe. Other forms of illicit commerce, such as trafficking in people, are also proliferating as criminal syndicates leverage new and sophisticated technology to elude detection. The second trend is the global demographic transition that is already underway. Overall, population growth in the United States, Europe, and Asia is slowing, if not stalled in some areas, which means that the proportion of young to elderly is shrinking. While the rest of the world is getting older, this is not the case in Africa. Continued high rates of population growth in Africa means the total number of youth there continues to expand. Africa's economies will have to grow and generate new jobs at a significantly faster pace just to keep up with population growth. If they fail, then we can expect to see increased social discontent and migration from Africa into Europe, Asia, and the Americas. Growing urbanization in Africa will also result in increased pressure on transportation and power infrastructure and demand for government services, particularly in the areas of health, education, and sanitation. With increased migration across borders, the populations of Africa's megacities will be even more multinational, multi-ethnic, and crowded. The third trend I want to highlight is global warming. This is the least predictable of the trends and the one in which Africa probably is least prepared and probably least focused on. Scientists are unable at this point to forecast the environmental and meteorological impact of climate change on Africa with any great deal of precision, but they know it is occurring. The rate of warming will vary across Africa, and weather patterns could become more erratic, with some places experiencing significantly more rainfall and others more severe droughts. Coastal cities and communities could experience flooding and destructive erosion, leading to mass displacement. After decades of decline, Africa's agricultural sector is only now beginning to revive, but global warming could impede the significant gains in crop yields that are needed to keep up with Africa's rising food demands. We have already seen the adverse consequences of food crises on human welfare and political stability, and can expect possibly more and worse if Africa is unable to manage the inevitable environmental stresses that are likely to come as a result of global warming. In the face of just these three trends, African nations will need to be more outwardly focused and take bold, concrete steps towards integrating their economies and infrastructure and cooperating more and better on security and other transnational challenges that they face. To do this effectively, they will also need to live up to a set of common principles based on respect for human rights, democracy, and honest and transparent governance. Many of these principles are already defined in the African Union Charter and the related institutions such as the peer review mechanism. The United States will also need to continue to reorient its policies and approaches to African issues in ways that support and strengthen regional cooperation and integration. Much of U.S. assistance to Africa is already focused on transnational challenges, especially in the areas of health, peacekeeping, and counterterrorism. But we continue to consider new programs in new areas such as food security and climate change. In conclusion, I would like to reiterate my appreciation for those of you who have organized this important conference. Whether in Libya or Sudan, there are many pressing issues that demand our immediate attention across the continent. But it is important for all of us to focus as well on the more distant challenges looming ahead. I look forward to this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Johnny. Really, in a very short period of time, you listed all the challenges that Africa has in front of it, and I'm grateful because let's say the ranking of the problems was perfect, and the idea of the policy needed is now more clear. I do now let the floor to the representative of the World Bank in order to, let's say, complete this, not only this list, but to start to hint to the policy needed. So I ask you, Mrs. Ezekwesili, to talk about that and take the floor, please. The floor and the microphone too.
Well, thank you very much. My pleasure to be here, and greetings from President Zolik, former Prime Minister Prodi. Regrets his inability to join you. I am Obiageli Ezekwesili, and I am the Vice President for the Africa region at the World Bank, and it's my great delight to participate in this discussion on Africa. I also want to acknowledge my dear friend, Johnnie Carson, and thank you for setting the stage. I am very pleased to speak to the new challenges for development facing Africa, and to discuss how realizing Africa's development promise is inextricably linked to and dependent on peace, security, democracy, and trade. We live in very exciting times of amazing technological advances, and you did hear what Johnny had to say about that. But I like to look at it from its opportunities and promises more than the challenges that we can surely, through policy, take care of. Great improvements in health, but also we live in very delicate times with threats of terrorism, and Johnny dwelt a lot on that, the dangers of human trafficking and other forms of exploitation. In an interwoven and interdependent world, what affects one region ultimately transmits to all the rest. And the negative externalities are issues that we will have to continue to manage in a globally integrated world. That is why I'd like to open my remarks by paying attention to the fact that we do live in a time of stagnation and declining global economy, with fewer jobs being created to cater for millions seeking employment. In the case of the continent that we discussed today, it is factual that 7 to 10 million young people join the labor market every year. That is a destabilizing data. The fact of fewer jobs for youth is compounded by the growing number of these youths. And so if you looked at this issue from a stock and flow model, it is obvious that this is a major challenge that would require policy, institutions, as well as the necessary investments to curb. Almost half of Africa's population is under 25 years. About 75% of Africa's population is under the age of 35. It is estimated by 2050, Africa would account for 29% of the people between the ages of 15 and 24. That is significant. And this is about 384 million of the total 1.2 billion so categorized people globally. This is exacerbated by an education system that not only churns out graduates either in areas that are not in high demand for Africa's development, or simply graduates with skills gaps that do not match the jobs in the market into which they have graduated. So even though it is a time of opportunity, when we can prioritize and optimize the development impact through the growth that has happened in Africa in recent times, and the fact of Africa's rebound, even at a time of global economic crisis, it is the case that even sectors like information and communication technology, which is the sector described in revolutionary terms in terms of its impact on the continent, as the data aspect of it is still accessible only to 25% of Africans. And when it comes to mobile telephony, that only about 3% of the predominantly urban dwellers when it comes to the internet. It is also a time of grave concern and disquiet. No less than 1.2 billion people around the world are still trapped in pernicious poverty, half of that being in Africa. The example of the unemployed Tunisian graduate who set himself ablaze, sparking off what we know as the Arab Spring, has shown how extremely linked to development and prosperity for all of mankind it is to demand for democracy, demand for voice, for inclusion, demand for accountability and transparency in the management of public resources, and the demand for the fight against insecurity, the fight against corruption and impunity. Even as we worry, we must, however, applaud sub-Saharan Africa for not only rapidly rebounding from the global financial and economic crisis, but for also being one of the regions growing the fastest at this time of economic crisis. It will expand, according to our own data, by 4.5% this year, 5.1% next year, 5.4% in 2012. Healthy GDP growth is an essential prerequisite, but it is not sufficient for creating the larger and broader economic opportunities and jobs that is needed. Robust growth has not been sufficient to guarantee the achievement of the MDGs in the majority of African countries, despite the progress that we have seen. At the World Bank, we recognize that these challenges have associated opportunities. For instance, the World Bank strategy for Africa, which only in March was endorsed by the board, outlines 3 key building blocks for advancing Africa's prosperity. The first block is competitiveness and employment. It is in recognition of the fact that growth not being sufficient, we must make growth inclusive, broad, and shared. And the capacity of government to play the role of the distributor of the benefits of growth means that our work in improving the capacity and the governance systems on the continent becomes even much more crucial. But for the successfulness of the job creation agenda, Africa would need to diversify its economy. Today, a lot of Africa's economy is enclave. It is oil, it is gas, and it is mining. And Africa must therefore pursue sectoral reforms that would create the structural transformation of these economies to broaden the sources of growth. Africa is one of today's world attractive destinations for investment, even though it still battles with the business environment issues. We have seen nascent progress, and this has resulted in Africa attracting more FDI than India, and just below the FDI going to China. It would need to become a friendlier investment destination, and it needs to create opportunities for indigenous small and medium-sized enterprises, including those led by women, who constitute 50% of Africa's population. This would mean that Africa needs to continue to create jobs in its area of comparative advantage. And that is why at the World Bank today we say that agriculture is the next big thing that must happen in Africa. Agriculture underpins the economies of most African economies. As a matter of fact, agriculture is the most significant private sector in Africa today. And governments must begin to look at it as such. It accounts for 30% of GDP in the region, 60% of its employment, and 40% of its export earnings, except that it is a sector that has not been optimized in terms of the growth potentials that it holds. The second building block in our strategy is addressing the vulnerability of African economies and of African people in terms of resilience to macroeconomic shocks and idiosyncratic shocks in the areas of health, political violence, climate change related, and disaster risk management. The story behind the Arab Spring is one that highlights the fact that sustainable development can only be assured where we ensure economic and social inclusion in the design and implementation of programs. What our WDR on conflict-affected states, our WDR on security, development, and conflict suggests is that we often find that in low-income, fragile, conflict-affected countries, there is a 20% gap in poverty reduction compared to countries whose development is unperturbed by this crisis. A situation that is worsened by climate change, already made manifest in drought, in floods, coastal erosion, deforestation, and a fall in agricultural productivity. In fact, for some of the staples, we already see a 50% decline in productivity as a result of the impact of climate change. And so Africa cannot be complacent by any stretch of the imagination in mitigating as well as adapting to the challenges of climate change. All of these also nestle within the need for social safety programs that would address the needs of the poorest and the most vulnerable, including particularly women, children, and youth, creating income-generating activities and strengthening access to affordable and reliable basic social services. These are the kinds of development that dividends that citizens deserve in post-conflict societies in order to ensure not a relapse to violence. The cycle of violence robs countries of at least 30% of their GDP. Thirdly, Africa must invest in strengthening governance and in building the capacity as well as the right institutions for peace, for security, for democratic governance, for transparency and accountability. And this is the foundation of the strategy that we implement today on the continent. While it is well known that corruption is a growing problem that hobbles development and robs poor people of opportunities for economic and social advance, what is less evident, at least until recently, is that there is a more insidious effect of corruption in spawning violence that not only threatens the viability and stability of whole nations, but can engulf entire regions. Here are some basic facts. About 1.5 billion people live in countries affected by political and criminal violence, causing human misery and disrupting development. Over 90% of the civil wars in the 2000s occurred in countries that have already experienced civil war in the previous 30 years. Coercion and patronage may be seen by governments as ways to preserve stability, but it is a mistake. Corruption, human rights abuse, and low government effectiveness makes 30 to 40% more vulnerable to violence. Mr. Chair, the message is simple. We need to support Africa in building strong institutions, legitimate institutions. We need to support Africa in having governance systems and justice systems and robust economies that deliver jobs to the citizens, because all of these are crucial to breaking the cycles of violence. This is why the World Bank is committed to fostering good governance, not just in Africa south of the Sahara, but in the rest of the regions where we work. The bank has set aside 3.5 million to support the active participation of citizens group in the process of development. Whatever odds Africa may face in the past and continues to face, one thing that is clear is that the new challenges confronting Africa, which this conference seeks to confront, pale in comparison to the many opportunities that Africa presents. Simply put, I consider Africa as not just the future, but Africa is the now for people who would see beyond the challenges. And this means that only wise investors would see the opportunities in providing for the infrastructure gap of as much as $40 8 billion, net 17 billion, which can be called back through better efficiencies in current spends of about 45 billion. It is the wise investor that would see the opportunities in improving basic services delivery on the continent. And partners like the World Bank, as well as the United States government, must begin to see Africa as investment proposition, not just as an aid destination. To that end, I must re-emphasize, Mr. Chair, that it is ultimately African leaders and the people of Africa who alone can seize this moment in history and the chance that it offers to significantly improve governance, mitigate the negative impact of violence, insecurity, injustice, and to lift the majority poor out of poverty. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. You entered so really deeply and clearly in the new challenge, and you stressed how different are the African problems from the other continents. You know, when you say 30% of GDP is agriculture and 60% of people are employed in agriculture, and the age pyramid, it's completely different. You know, you have problems that are not the problems of other continents. Say a couple of generations ago, you could in some way equiparate Africa with Asia or some Asian country. Now, it's all the basic characteristics are different, you know. And clearly, you stressed also some question mark like climate change, and at this point we have to be very prudent in judgment, but we have to keep it in account because in the next year we shall learn how heavy and how difficult will be for the future African development. Now I give the floor to Zachary Muburi-Muita, Head of United Nations Office to the African Union. So we shall see, start to analyze the problem of the relation between institutions that will be so important in the future of Africa.
Thank you, President Prodi. Colleagues, good morning. I would also want to add my voice to express gratitude to the organizers of this gathering to share insights into this difficult subject of how to enhance the cause of peace and security on the continent of Africa, and how that interrelates with the other global challenges. For the last several years, I was working closely with the United Nations as permanent representative of Kenya in New York. However, today I'll be speaking to you in a relatively new role, which I assumed 8 months ago, as the special representative of the UN Secretary General to the African Union. From here, I'll be going on to New York, where I'll be making a maiden presentation to the Security Council on the work of this new office and how much value is being added by the UN having a political representation at the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa. It has long been established that the peace and security challenges across the globe far surpass the UN's ability to effectively and sustainably address them alone. As far back as 1992, the then Secretary General, Boutros Ghali, in his report, An Agenda for Peace, called for regional organizations to play a greater role in international peace and security. Nowhere has the UN been more stretched than in Africa, as the UN Under Secretary General for field support, Ms. Malcora mentioned yesterday, up to more than 70% of all UN keeping budget is in Africa. More than half of those troops deployed come from member states outside the continent of Africa. It is therefore clear that a strong AU capable of mobilizing African troops and intervening effectively to address and resolve conflicts in Africa is in everybody's interest. In fact, the principle of such intervention is not only foreseen but encouraged in Chapter 8 of the UN Charter that was drafted back in 1945. Therefore, whereas the United Nations is responsible overall for global peace and security under Chapter 7, so the regional and sub-regional organizations are mandated to take care of peace and security issues in their regions under Chapter 8. It is foreseen that regional organizations could undertake enforcement action with authorization of the Security Council. The emergence of the AU in the last decade with the structures, the legal framework included, will further enhance the ability to address conflict in Africa, and this has given new life to the application of Chapter 8. One has just to recall the case of, for instance, of ECOWAS, and what a starring role it has had to play in West Africa, more recently, of course, in Ivory Coast, but even before that, in pacifying situations such as in Liberia and Sierra Leone. On the eastern side of the continent, IGAD, a sub-regional organization, has had a great measured success in giving the international community the ability to engage in Somalia, and has also had a starring role to play in the implementation of the CPA, the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, that ushered in peace after nearly half a century of conflict in the Sudan. The AU is therefore obviously an essential player in African peace and security, highly motivated by the member states' desire to help Africa solve its own problems. The AU is in a position to more effectively rally African support to deal with continental problems. Just as the UN cannot, in the long run, manage peace and security on the continent on its own, in the short run at least, the AU has neither the financial nor the qualified human resource to take by themselves on these tremendous challenges. But it is not merely a question of resources or carving up the responsibility. The UN Security Council, 1/5 of which is made up of African states, is not about to completely delegate in Africa its global responsibility for peace and security. So while we are all committed to supporting the AU strengthen its role in peace and security, the UN will always retain primary responsibility and remain actively engaged in peace and security on the continent. Therefore, the need for coordination and cooperation between the two organizations is very essential. Operational coordination between the UN and the AU is already deeply underway, with a success in some areas, as I've mentioned above. To repeat, the UNAMID case in Darfur is just one example where the UN and the AU cooperate very, very well, and with the joint mission that is UNAMID. The other example of cooperation is the AMISOM, the African mission in Somalia, which is an African force, but it is supported by the UN and the rest of the international community. So those are two different models of advancing peace and security issues on the continent. A joint operation, UNAMID, or where you have African troops, an African mission, but is supported by the rest of the international community. There are hard lessons that are drawn from those two examples, and exactly how we move into the future, whether in joint operations or the Somalia one, it's really, the jury is still out there. But the one interest, the one thing that is known for sure, the national interest, is what in many cases draws nations into conflict, conflicting pursuit of the national interest. But as we start off on the second decade of the 21st century, I think what we must ask, the hard question we must ask at forums like this, is there something like a human interest, a global interest that can surpass the national interest as it is traditionally pursued? How else can we then tackle the issues of poverty, for instance, or the noble goals of the MDGs, the issue of climate change, or enhancement of the human rights across the globe, the pandemics that know no borders, the immigration and the reasons that are caused by this, the issues of terrorism. If we cannot come together how else are we going to tackle these issues? If we continue carving up continent and in the pursuit of the national interest, the pursuit of these noble goals will continue being a mirage. Without going into the pros and cons of what methods should be applied, our sense is that the new models will necessarily continue to emerge to suit the unique circumstances that each conflict will dictate. While closer cooperation is ideal, it is not always feasible. The UN and Security Council and the AU and Peace and Security Council will not always share the same perspective. And a great perspective has emerged when the Security Council and the AU Peace and Security Council have dealt on particular issues. It could be Libya, it could be Ivory Coast, it could be even Somalia. And barely a month ago, the UN Security Council was in Addis Ababa and held a session with the AU Peace and Security. And as was expected, various diverse opinions emerged. And those who would be quick to be judgmental could easily throw out the baby with the bathwater. And we would have to be careful that even in our differences, we are able to see the positive signs that emerge from that, because we do not have any option than to continue engaging. So as I proceed, Mr. Chairman, I think the issue of poverty and the prevalence of conflict is almost like the chicken and egg sort of a situation. And unless the underlying causes of poverty are addressed, it will be very difficult to move forward and address the major causes of peace and security. Regionalism, as has emerged since yesterday, is one very important tool of so doing, because many countries are small. They offer very small markets, some under 5 million people, the majority under 10 million people. And the clear examples that are coming out through regional integration, whether in the East African community or in SADC or in COMESA, is one way of ensuring that the fragile economies of Africa could consolidate their lot and therefore be able to face the external world much better. The issue of investment in agriculture is going to be very key. Most of the African countries are agricultural. 80% of the population live in the countryside, and yet the experts tell us that the investment in agriculture has declined from the 70s from 10% to only about 3% today. So the majority of the farmers are for subsistence farmers, but without the ability to reach markets, without the ability to gain a profitable gain from their produce, it becomes difficult to tackle the food insecurity or to have the resources to plant a new crop for the following season. So you keep having, therefore, the contradiction of agricultural societies that are not able to feed themselves, and that in itself causes insecurity, causes negative advances to issues of climate change, sustainable development, and everything else. So I wish to stop there and maybe look forward to an engagement later of Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Now the floor is to the Ambassador and Special Representative for African Affairs of the People's Republic of China, Ambassador Guijin Liu. I don't need to stress how important has become China for Africa and how important will be its role, really, to follow a Chinese expression, is of utmost importance if we want to help Africa to have an harmonious development. So the word to Ambassador Liu, please.
Respected Chairman, organizers in Washington for this conference, first of all, I would like to register my appreciation and thanks for the Prime Minister and Professor Prodi and the co-organizers. Well, ladies and gentlemen, last year, 17 African countries celebrated their 50th anniversary of independence. And this year, 17 African countries have held or will hold multilateral party elections. This shows that Africa has arrived at what we Chinese call the age of standing on its own feet, which means Africa has matured and accomplished a lot and continues to explore its own ways of development and political system. It is well recognized that Africa has made achievements in safeguarding independence, in developing their national economy, and in enhancing living standards of their people. And also in strengthening solidarity and taking part in regional and international affairs. But the gap between Africa as a whole and the developed world is still expanding, except for a few countries like Ethiopia. The overwhelming majority of African countries have great difficulties in attaining the MDGs set up by the United Nations and face tremendous challenges in economic and social development. At macro level and in a broader sense, I think Africa is confronted with at least 3 major challenges in the area of development. The first challenge is peace and social stability. Africa remains one of the most unstable regions in this world, and the reason is very complicated. Dramatic changes are unfolding there in Northern Africa, and the conflicts in Somalia and Sudan have dragged for such a long time, and the situation in Côte d'Ivoire is also worrying. According to researchers of Oxfam and Safer World, in the 15 years between 1990 and 2005, after the Cold War, Africa wasted as much as 300 billion US dollars due to war and conflicts. It's equivalent to total amount of foreign aid the continent received during the same period. Compared with countries of peace and stability, the infant mortality rate in those conflict-stricken African countries is 50% high. The mortality rate 15% high, and the average life expectancy 5 years lower. The figures tells volumes about a truth. There can be no development without peace and stability. The second challenge is economic structure. Regarding this frequently discussed topic, we do not need to elaborate on the root causes. As a result of Africa's failing to catch up the express train of economic globalization, its most competitive commodity up to now is still primary products, including raw materials. According to a report issued by the Standard Bank in March last year, although Africa has arrangements and mechanisms with its major trade partners, but its main exports are also mineral and energy products in its trade with not only China, but also European countries and the United States of America. For example, in the year 2008 and 2009, according to the report, mineral and energy products accounted for 80% of its export to China, around 80% of its exports to the US, and 70% of its exports to Germany. It is regrettable that this undesirable situation is not something unique to China. And I totally agree with my colleagues, the previous speakers, the Assistant Secretary of State, Ambassador Johnnie Carson, that inter-Africa's trade is just 10%. They need to expand it, well, out of their own efforts. And also, according to the Vice President of World Bank, and that the African countries need to do its utmost to try to diversify its economy and the structure of its trade. But that should be done with working together of the international community, China included. The third challenge is development model and governance. African regional and sub-regional organizations such as the African Union, SADC, and ECOWAS have been exploring development models and governance that are more suitable to Africa. When people talk about Africa, they tend to think it is a whole continent. But when you look at the specific situations in individual African countries, you can see huge differences in history, culture, people, religion, and development level. However, the outside world has always tried to impose a kind of one-size-for-all treatment. And most of those treatments turn out to be not that effective. For an example, like that ESOP, Economic Structural Adjustment, which is, I think, a kind of failure. And so what is the way out for Africa's development? The answer could be multi-pronged and should vary according to the specific conditions of each country. In my opinion, at least, these three aspects deserve more attention from us. First, the international community should show greater respect to Africa and try to reduce interference in Africa's internal affairs. Listen more to the Africans, what they want, and think more for Africa, increase inputs to Africa, and take more practical steps on behalf of Africa's development in order to bring real benefits to the African people. Second, we should encourage and provide sincere help to Africa to resolve its own problems in the African ways. African countries have the right to determine their own destinies and safeguard their dignity, and because they know themselves better than any other one else. When it comes to peace and security, more opportunities should be given to the African countries, the African Union, and other sub-regional organizations. Third, African countries should carry out their own political and economic reforms in the light of their respective national situations, with a view to getting rid of malpractices, realizing good governance, and laying a foundation for their enduring political stability and long-term development. This requires time, of course, and also help from the international community. China commits herself to help Africa in a more dynamic way. Next year, we are going to hold the 5th FOCAC conference, China-Africa Cooperation Forum. And we are determined to build more infrastructure projects, more roads, more schools and hospitals, for Africa and also expand our trade and investment there in 2 areas at least, in infrastructure and also in agriculture. I think these would be the 2 priorities in the areas of the development in Africa China commits to help. And also China determines to work together with the international community, with the developed world, to help Africa as a whole and to play a more dynamic and a kind of proactive role in the areas of peace and stability in Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. You underlined not only the dramatic aspects of Africa, but also the, by many people, unexpected characteristic of the African economy. And you stressed that the exports are almost the same in terms of quality if the exports are going to China or to United States or to Europe. And this is, it puts an end to a dispute concerning who is exploiting Africa raw materials and who is not. The exports are just the same to any part of the world. I think that it's important to stress that. It's Africa is weak in terms of, let's say, the quality of its export vis-à-vis China, vis-à-vis Europe, vis-à-vis United States, and I think this is a really important starting point to start a strong international cooperation vis-à-vis Africa, and not to use Africa as a playing field, as a battlefield in which we confront ourselves. And then the other point is to reduce the interference in the internal African affairs. This means to make any effort to pass from the bilateral to the multilateral way of action. And this is the basic point. We started these meetings, last year in Bologna, this year here, next year I do hope in Addis Ababa, just in order to change the general attitude vis-à-vis Africa. It's not a Chinese problem, it's not an American problem, it's not a European problem, it's a general problem. And so thank you for this, let's say, indication and for this observation. And now the last speaker, but not the least speaker, before the coffee break is the ambassador of Italy to United States, who was previous ambassador to United Nations, but even in his previous diplomatic experience, he has a deep, deep, deep knowledge of international institutions, a deep knowledge of African problem. And so he will complete the picture that we received this morning from this first session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President Prodi. Thank you very much indeed, first of all, for your very kind words, but also for this opportunity of attending this important conference and especially to listen to what is emerging already as extremely important discussion in this panel, as it was yesterday in the previous presentation panel at the conference and during the conversation dinner we had, but also for the opportunity of providing some observation on behalf of my authorities on the current issues and especially issues which are particularly important for my country. But I would be remiss if I were not expressing also the appreciation and the congratulation of my authorities to the organizers, especially to yourself, President Prodi, to Assistant Secretary Johnnie Carson, to Dr. Jessica Einhorn, and to Vice President Obiageli Ezekwesili for participating to this part of the discussion. Well, Assistant Secretary Carson has already outlined a number of points which are taken up again by the subsequent speakers, which are of key importance in the United Nations system, but also bilaterally to each major partner of African countries and Africa as a whole. And these are, without any doubt, climate change, energy and food security, unemployment, especially of the younger generation. It was very important what was said by the Vice President of the World Bank concerning the demographic imbalances, which are always more evident and which reflect on the potentiality of growth of the African economies. And in that framework also, and especially migratory flows and efficient and democratic governance. Africa has become, over a number of years, the paradigm of the most important issues which all of us must face in the 21st century. And this is why its future concerns us all and requires a special focus and attention, and as was emphasized very clearly just a few days ago during her visit by the Secretary of State visit to Africa by Secretary of State Clinton. We share a number of the views which were expressed on that occasion by the Secretary of State, but in a more pronounced way, because Italy's history, Italy's location and political stance lead us, Italians, to look at Africa as a natural and very privileged interlocutor. Respect and mutual understanding distinguish all our relations with the African countries. Our proximity to the northern shores of this continent entails that Italy is in a unique position, and at this time of great change, my country, today more than ever, is the gateway to Europe for Africa's migrants. It is not only the physical gateway for Africa's migrants, but is also a symbolic gateway, especially for the expectation of many young people who see in the emigration the only way to fulfill the minimum expectation that they have for their economic future. Africa is therefore quickly turning from being a generator of crisis, as my friend, the Special Envoy of the Secretary General to the African Union has said, stressing the points of peacekeeping, the cooperation in multilateral fora that we have in order to bring peace and security to African countries, is quickly turning from a generator of crisis in a much more positive perspective of being a catalyst for opportunities. And I think that one of the major opportunities were, again, already very well described in the agricultural sector. It is very impressive, the character of the African economy and the contribution that agriculture could give to the food security of the worldwide community. But there is also a caution to be put there, I believe, in our expectation. It was said already by the representative of the World Bank. But I remember quite a recent lecture given by President Prodi on the food security, when he did point the fact that productivity in agricultural production is constantly decreasing over the last few years. And the imbalance in the population, which is getting a clear trend in Africa, especially sub-Saharan Africa, shows that the fastest increase in population over the last 20, 30 years is happening there in comparison to the rest of the world. Therefore, this imbalance between demographic trend, productivity in agriculture, and structural difficulties, which were outlined yesterday by the President of Malawi, gives really the sense of the challenge that we are facing for food security of the continent. But there is no doubt that over the last few years, not only has it increased its economic importance of the whole continent, but it has achieved a greater political clout on the world arena. And especially the events of the last few months, which have in a way revolutionized Northern Africa and the Middle East, have added the desire for a full recognition of the political and civic rights of citizens of the Mediterranean to the wish for more international influence. A historic change which has made everyone, Europe and the United States, first and foremost, renew their efforts. President Obama's speech on the Middle East and Northern Africa, pronounced at the State Department last May 19th, is a very eloquent proof of just this. Naturally, the wind of change has also brought with it a phase of turbulence. New challenges are emerging in the relationship between freedom and security, between democracy and extremism, between economic uncertainty and social stability. The existence and the prospect of huge migrations from North Africa constitute a very complex issue for my country, an issue which includes law and order, economic and social aspects, in a way which is not different, to come again to statements made by the highest authority in this country, not very different from those which President Obama addressed in his speech at El Paso recently. Following the Jasmine Revolution, some 43,000 immigrants have reached the shores of Italy. Over 18,000 of them were mostly Eritrean and Somalis, and they have come from Libya. The small Italian island of Lampedusa, with its only 5,000 inhabitants, was literally overwhelmed by a flow of migrants which in a couple of months reached the point of 35,000. But my country has faced and managed this exceptional flow with, I believe, generosity and responsibility. And let me bring here the news that I just learned from my capital, that concerning exactly Libya, tomorrow my authorities will sign with the representative of the Transitional National Council from Benghazi an agreement for cooperating and regulating the flow of irregular immigrants, and also the question of cooperation on the shores of the Libyan state. So we consider this a very important step, because the pre-existing agreement with the previous regime, with the regime which is still in place in Tripoli, will be validated by the new authorities that we have recognized in Benghazi, so say the Transitional National Council. It is an important step forward, and in that framework I would like also to make known that in the next few days, exactly on the 25th and 26th of this month, my government will support the gathering of a great assembly of Libyan representatives for all tribes from Libya and the major leaders of the Libyan society, in an effort to contribute to the emerging governance of the country, to the emerging democratic institutions and the concrete representation of the Libyan people. So these two aspects are important also in the framework, to be considered also in the framework of this conference, because they give a sense of the engagement and commitment of my government to bring some stabilization in a very critical part of North Africa. At the same time, my government has also asked the other European partners to come to a more rapid and effective response in terms of the migration issue. because we believe that this phenomenon cannot be dealt with only by those countries whose geographical position puts them both literally and metaphorically at the fore. It is a phenomenon which requires an approach which considers its multidimensional nature. Each country of origin, of transit or destination must take on its share of responsibility in a broader framework of solidarity and partnership between European and African countries. Just a few days ago, the President of the Italian Republic, Giorgio Napolitano, spoke on the moral and human aspect of this problem. He called for an end to indifference towards migrants and the too many tragedies which affect them, and launched an appeal to the international community and the European Union for a strong and moral reaction. A more effective solidarity among member states and a renewed cooperation with third countries should lead the European Union strategy along two lines. In the first place, by strengthening policies against illegal trafficking, and secondly, by promoting a coherent approach to abet the economic development of the Mediterranean. In view of the next European Council, which will take place on June the 24th, Prime Minister Berlusconi and President Sarkozy have sent a joint letter to their colleagues and to the heads of the EU institutions to relaunch the EU's commitment to tackling illegal immigration in the Mediterranean. And Italian-French requests have been well received by the Commission, which has already adopted a number of measures. And the following measures are especially noteworthy. First, the reinforcement of Frontex, which is the agency which has the function to deal in a common way, a collective way with migrations, and of the joint management of common borders. Second, an improved sharing of the financial burden, which is related to migrations. Thirdly, an effective coordination of possible exceptional measures related to the Schengen Treaty, because you know that there were problems between some member states in the application of Schengen Treaty during the major heat of this human flow to our shores. Fourthly, agreements with countries like Tunisia, Egypt, and Morocco, which envisage economic incentives and better mobility for workers and students, that is to say, mobility partnership agreement that we are seeking as European Union, that the European Union should seek with partners in Africa. And fifth, definition of a common European asylum system by next year. This is an urgent issue that we would like to tackle at European level. And we believe that the European Council should have a thorough discussion on these proposals and give new impetus to these policies. Addressing illegal immigration alone is far from being enough to provide young Africans with real opportunities for a future in their own country. To tackle the roots of migration, we need a more ambitious strategy. And the Italian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Franco Frattini, has mentioned a fresh start and a comprehensive review of our partnership with the southern shores of the Mediterranean, focused on economic integration, on institution building, and on good governance. A plan which should foresee a Mediterranean Partnership Fund for the private sector, a Mediterranean Business Development Initiative for small and medium enterprises, and the Euro-Mediterranean Erasmus program with easier entry visas for students. Americans and Europeans must be together in all this. Washington has already announced the creation of a Trade and Investment Partnership Initiative, while the latest G8 summit has established a Deauville Partnership. In conclusion, even before the Arab Spring, globalization had brought to our attention the need to look at human rights in a rather different and enhanced perspective. Rights and responsibilities must be globalized, above all when it comes to human dignity. This is especially true for the Mediterranean region, for Sub-Saharan Africa, for the Middle East, and for Asia. Italy, that is to say Europe and the United States, share a deep conviction that these values must be central to any strategy for countries in these regions. And it is this common approach that makes transatlantic bonds unique and irreplaceable. a fact that was underlined once again by President Obama during his recent visit to Europe. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. You have magistrally touched the hot points of today African politics, starting from Libya, but you stressed also a point that was only touched before, that's the immigration. You know, if we don't implement a strong development in Africa, and if we take account of the previous speech, the immigration push can only increase in the future. We have no alternative. Otherwise, we apply a new policy, or the immigration will certainly increase, because when you have 60% of people in agriculture, bracket of age, of young age, dominating the society, the problem of urbanization that is speeding up, you put all together and you translate this in an increasing step of immigrants. So this is an additional reason, not only for a European policy vis-à-vis immigration, but for a policy in Africa in order to have an alternative to immigration. Concerning European policy, clearly, even in this case, like in all the cases concerning the international organizations, the problem is to make a jump in terms of quality and quantity of the Mediterranean and African policy. I am obliged to repeat what I told yesterday about the G8. We had great engagements, but the reality of the funds is scarce. When President of the European Commission, I had in front of me the Minister of Finance, and I always lost. You know, it was clear, you know, because everything was more important than external aid. And as happens in all contemporary democracy, there is no lobby for external aid. And so when some money is needed, it's generally subtracted to this chapter of the balance sheet. And I'm very, very happy to listen that there is this deep feeling that something have changed, you know, so it's also a national interest to be more proactive in this field. Before going to the well-deserved coffee break, I give a supplement of floor to Dr. Ezekwesili, Vice President of the World Bank for Africa, because she had some additional remark to make, and we are happy to listen to her because she, as I repeat, can be with us later in our session. Thank you.
Prime Minister Prodi, I would not like to give you a check for not calling my last name very well.
Sorry, I tried, but your name is impossible. It's beyond any European effort.
All right, I'm going to give you a coaching afterward. Well, thank you very much. I apologize that I would not be able to stay on for the afternoon discussions. And so when the Prime Minister offered me the opportunity to say some last words, I couldn't miss it. I think that the most important thing that I would like to leave around the table following the presentation by the ambassador from China is simply that both the United States and Europe has got to look at Africa from the perspective of economic policy. And the policy that traps Africa as a destination solely for aid is not supportive of the kind of economic growth promise that it holds today. And significantly, what we see is that the private sector in Europe as well as in the United States are beginning to have that interest, but they need public policy to support their foray. And I do not think that the public policies have in any way upgraded their substance and content. Because often when I sit around events like this and I listen to presentations that come, they are too government-centric. And not only are they government-centric, but they simply continue with the old mode of looking at Africa. Only last Monday, Helios, a private investment firm, had an oversubscription to its investment fund for Africa to the extent of $900 million. Just a few months ago, Carlyle, am I calling that name right? They raised just about $1 billion to start off their sub-Saharan Africa program. The narrative on Africa has changed. It really has. And we need to upgrade it within the confines of rooms in Europe and in North America where policies are being made. If that does not happen, you will be trapped in this totally unproductive conversation as to whether the emerging economies really are doing the right thing or not in Africa. The most important conversation that the old friends of Africa owe Africa is the support in building the systems that will enable the continent engage in an equal opportunity conversation with any trading partner. Because trade is the next most important thing that must enable Africa's emergence. It already is the next frontier, but it needs the support through policy to really take it to that threshold where it can firmly say it has arrived. I thought that those were last points I'd like to make. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now a short coffee break.